I still remember the sound of the iron gate creaking open that morning. It wasn't just a creak. It was a long, tired groan, as if the entire estate was exhaling at the sight of me returning. In the past, whenever I drove through that gate, I did it with the careless confidence of a spoiled daughter who believed the world bent to her whims. But this time, my old car jerked, as if even it doubted me. The engine coughed, rattled, then settled into a resentful hum, like it was saying, "Really? You want to come back here?" From the back seat, my son clutched his superhero backpack, eyes wide as he stared at the mansion ahead. 7 years old and already suspicious of grandeur. "Mom," he said, voice caught somewhere between awe and disappointment, "this house looks like a castle, but why does it look so sad?" I laughed, but the sound cracked in my throat, sharp and brittle. "Because, sweetheart, this is Grandma's castle, and the princess who used to live here doesn't have enough money to buy her glass slippers anymore." He blinked at me with that innocent seriousness kids carry, the kind that makes you regret every attempt at humor. As the gate shut behind us, with a metallic clang, I felt less like a returning daughter and more like a prisoner walking back into her old cell. The house loomed, tall and white, the roof tiles dark and heavy with age. The front garden, once meticulously kept, had patches of wild grass pushing through the cobblestones. The flower beds, those famous symbols of my family's taste and refinement, looked like they'd surrendered to weeds long ago. The whole place whispered a truth no one in my family liked to admit. Wealth ages too, and badly. My mother stepped out onto the front porch. She looked as poised as ever, slim in her beige sweater, her silver hair pinned neatly back. Her face had always been beautiful in a cold way, classic, untouchable, like the statues in a museum. She wrapped her arms around me quickly, more a formality than affection, then bent down to pat my son's head. "Well," she said in that clipped tone I knew too well, "look who finally decided to come home. My golden boy." She smiled at him, warmly, genuinely. With me, it was only a glance. One of those quick, slicing looks mothers give their daughters when words would be too obvious, too merciful. Inside, the house smelled the same as it always had. Wood polish, dust, and a hint of lavender spray my mother used to mask the dampness that never truly left the old place. I dragged my suitcase across the marble floor and up the stairs to my old bedroom. The room hadn't changed. The lace curtains still hung stiffly by the window, and a faded landscape painting still occupied the wall above the bed. It was like stepping into a museum exhibit labeled Rich Girl, circa 2005. I dropped the suitcase with a thud. The weight of it wasn't in the clothes, but in everything the suitcase represented. Divorce papers, custody schedules, unpaid bills folded into handbags. The quiet humiliation of moving back in with your parents at 35. From downstairs, I heard my mother's voice calling for the housekeeper to prepare lunch. Then I realized the housekeeper wasn't the same one from my childhood. She was gone. Of course she was gone. The mansion didn't run the way it used to. Staff had been cut, expenses trimmed. Even the air felt thinner somehow, like the house itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw him through the window. A man in the garden, bent over the hedges. He wore a faded denim shirt and work gloves, his back straight despite the effort of trimming the roses. His movements were steady, deliberate, like each cut was a kind of meditation. I hadn't noticed him at first. He blended into the landscape the way certain people do, too ordinary for the grand setting, too essential to remove. It struck me that in all the times I'd come home to visit before, I'd never once paid attention to the gardener. He was just background. Today, though, The background was sharper than the foreground. "Mom." My son's voice startled me. He was standing in the doorway of my old room, holding his toy car in one hand. "Do we really have to live here? It smells funny." I knelt, brushed his hair back, and forced another smile. "Only for a while, honey. Just until Mom figures some things out." He studied me as if testing the truth of my words. Then he nodded solemnly and went back to pushing his car along the floor, making loud engine noises. His innocence filled the space that my pride had vacated. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the garden below, at the man who kept moving steadily, almost invisibly. And for the first time since I signed those papers and walked out of the courthouse with my new last name half erased, I wondered what starting over really meant. Not in the glossy, Instagram-worthy way, but in the messy, humiliating, profoundly human way. The mansion was still beautiful, but the cracks in the walls and the weeds in the garden told me I wasn't the only one falling apart. The first morning back at my mother's house began with orange juice on the carpet, not the delicate Persian rug in the living room. Thank God. But still, a bright splash across the hallway runner that my mother insisted had been imported from Florence. "It was gegal." My son looked at me with wide, guilty eyes, the glass rolling on its side like evidence in a crime scene. I crouched beside him, grabbed a handful of tissues, and whispered, "Shh, quick, before Grandma comes." "Before Grandma comes what?" Her voice floated from the staircase, like doom wrapped in silk. She appeared at the landing, perfectly put together, in a cream blouse and pearls, at 9 in the morning, as though she had a meeting with royalty. My mother surveyed the juice, the tissues, and me crouching like a fugitive. "It's fine," I said too quickly, too brightly. "Totally fine. Just a minor spill." Her lips pursed. In this house, minor spills are still stains. I wanted to tell her that in my old apartment, our cramped, rented 2-bedroom, orange juice stains were practically abstract art, that we used to joke about framing them. Instead, I dabbed frantically at the runner, trying to make it look like I had control over something. After breakfast, where my son asked why we couldn't have cereal like normal people instead of smoked salmon and capers, I escaped to the back garden under the excuse of needing fresh air. The truth was, I couldn't breathe in the house. It was full of ghosts, my younger self, my parents' expectations, the clinking of wine glasses at parties, where I was trotted out in designer dresses like a prize horse. The garden was quieter, or it would have been, if not for the steady hum of hedge trimmers. There he was again, the gardener. Same denim shirt, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the fabric at the chest. He didn't look up when I stepped outside, just kept working, as if the roses needed more attention than the messy daughter of his employer. I watched him for a moment longer than I meant to. Something about the rhythm of his movements, the calmness, the focus, made me jealous. I hadn't felt that kind of steady purpose in years. My life had been noise, court dates, arguments, lawyers, the constant background hum of anxiety. His world seemed quieter, rooted. Finally, he looked up. Not startled, not smiling, just acknowledging. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, as though he hadn't used it much yet that day. "Morning," I echoed, awkward. Then, like an idiot, I blurted, "Nice bushes." I immediately wanted to sink into the ground. He tilted his head slightly, as if deciding whether I was being sarcastic. Then he gave the faintest nod. "Thanks," and went back to trimming. I stood there, arms crossed, regretting every life choice that had led me to compliment a man's shrubbery. My son appeared at the sliding door behind me, face pressed against the glass. "Mom, can I go play?" Play where, eh? I asked. In the yard, with the guy. The guy is working, I said, horrified. He's not your babysitter. But before I could stop him, my son dashed outside, toy sword in hand, declaring himself protector of the roses. He circled the gardener like a knight guarding treasure. The man paused, glanced at me as if to ask permission. I shrugged helplessly. To my surprise, he didn't send my son away. He bent down, picked up a fallen branch, and handed it to him like a second sword. Guard the west side, he said seriously. My son saluted and ran off, stabbing at invisible enemies. For the first time since moving back, I laughed without bitterness. It startled me, the sound of it. Genuine, light, almost foreign. The gardener didn't react, but I caught the corner of his mouth twitch. Thanks, I murmured, for indulging him. Kids need something to fight for, he said simply, returning to his hedge. The sentence hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I wanted to ask him what he was fighting for, but my pride stopped me. Instead, I pretended to examine a rose, pricking my finger almost immediately. Blood welled up, sharp and red against my pale skin. He noticed, of course. Without a word, he set down the trimmers, pulled a clean rag from his pocket, and offered it to me. His hand was rough, calloused, but careful. I took the rag, pressing it against my finger, suddenly hyper-aware of how close we stood. Thanks, I said again, my voice smaller this time. He nodded once, then, as though sensing my mother's presence, even before she appeared, he stepped back just as she opened the patio door. There you are, she said, eyeing me with suspicion. Honestly, darling, if you're going to stand around in the sun, at least put on something decent. I looked down at my wrinkled t-shirt and yoga pants, my post-divorce uniform. My mother's disappointment was practically embroidered into the air around us. The gardener didn't flinch. He picked up his trimmers and went back to work. My son ran in circles, shouting victory cries, and I stood between them, bleeding finger hidden in a rag, realizing that life in this house was going to be messier than I'd imagined. By the third evening, I should have known what was coming. My mother called it a casual dinner, which, in her language, translated to white tablecloths, polished silverware, and at least 3 guests who had degrees from Ivy League schools. I stood in front of my childhood closet, which still smelled faintly of mothballs and Chanel No. 5, trying to find something presentable. My current wardrobe leaned heavily towards single mom survival mode. Faded jeans, sneakers, and t-shirts, bought on sale at Target. The dresses hanging in this closet were ghosts from another era. Silk, sequins, cocktail numbers that belonged to the version of me who hadn't yet Googled cheap lawyer near me. I finally picked a black dress that was simple enough to pass for chic. It fit tighter around the waist than I remembered, but Spanx are miracles disguised as torture devices. My son, oblivious, wore his superhero pajamas until my mother intercepted him with a horrified gasp. He will not sit at my dinner table looking like Spider-Man. 20 minutes later, he was squeezed into khaki pants and a button-down that made him look like a reluctant child actor in a toothpaste commercial. The dining room glowed under a chandelier that looked like it could have paid my rent for 3 months. My mother floated around pouring wine, greeting her guests with the kind of kisses that never touched actual skin. I slid into my seat, wishing I could slide under the table instead. The guests were exactly as I remembered, perfectly polished, perfectly opinionated, perfectly unaware of how small they made me feel. One woman, Mrs. Ellison, leaned across the table with a smile so sharp it could slice bread. So, dear, how are you managing these days? Must be such an adjustment. I almost laughed. Managing? I was juggling bills, court schedules, and a child who believed vegetables were an invention of evil scientists. It's an adventure, I said instead, stabbing at my salad. Keeps me humble. The table chuckled politely. My mother sipped her wine, eyes trained on me like a sniper. Mr. Bradley, a family friend who had always smelled vaguely of cigars and self-importance, chimed in. And what about work? Have you found something suitable? Translation. Are you still useful to society now that you've fallen off your pedestal? I'm freelancing, I replied. It sounded fancier than writing marketing copy for toothpaste brands at 2 a.m. Ah, he said, nodding as if I'd confessed to a chronic illness. Meanwhile, my son kicked me under the table, whispering loudly, Mom, can I be excused? This food is weird. I nearly said yes out of solidarity. Instead, I forced him to stay, bribing him with dessert. He sighed dramatically, stabbing a green bean like it had personally betrayed him. The conversation around me swirled. Investments, politics, art exhibitions in Paris. Words that once made me feel included now felt like a foreign language. I sipped my wine, letting the bitterness coat my tongue, and thought about the garden, about the man trimming roses without needing anyone's approval. It was absurd, really. Here I was, surrounded by wealth, pedigree, and prestige, and all I could think about was the gardener's hands. Steady, rough, purposeful, hands that didn't care if I wore the right dress or said the right thing. Mrs. Ellison interrupted my thoughts. And surely you'll be looking to remarry, dear. A woman like you can't stay alone forever. I nearly choked on my wine. Well, I think my marital track record speaks for itself. The sarcasm slipped out before I could stop it. There was a ripple of uncomfortable laughter. My mother's fork froze midair. Excuse me, I muttered, pushing back from the table. I fled to the patio, where the cool night air hit me like a blessing. The garden stretched out in the darkness, lit faintly by the moon. I could still smell the clipped roses, the faint tang of earth. I wondered if he was still out there somewhere, working late, or if he had already gone home to a small, quiet place where no one cared about wine pairings. Behind me, the laughter continued, muffled by walls and wealth. I leaned against the railing, my son's tiny hand slipping into mine. He had followed me out. Mom, he whispered, can we not do this again? I squeezed his hand. If I can help it, kid, never again. And in that moment, under the chandelier glow spilling faintly through the glass, I realized I wasn't just out of place at the dinner table. I was out of place in the entire world I used to call mine. It started with laundry. Doesn't everything humiliating in my life start with something domestic? I had strung my son's damp t-shirts across a clothesline in the garden because the old dryer inside the mansion sounded like a jet engine preparing for takeoff, and my mother had declared it unseemly to run it too often. She said, "We never dried clothes like commoners," to which I replied, "Well, welcome to the new Commoner Club." That afternoon, the sky was a pale blue, innocent looking. I thought I had a few hours of sunshine. 10 minutes later, the first fat raindrop smacked me squarely on the forehead, like nature's middle finger. "Mom," my son shouted from the porch, "the sky's leaking." "No kidding," I muttered, sprinting across the garden, grabbing shirts with the desperation of a woman rescuing hostages. The rain came faster, sheets of it, soaking my hair, plastering my cheap t-shirt to my skin. The clothes clung to the line, refusing to budge. I cursed under my breath, tugging uselessly. And then he was there, the gardener. He moved in from the hedges, calm, as if rain was just another Tuesday. He reached up, unhooked the stubborn clothespins in 2 efficient snaps, and thrust the bundle of shirts into my arms. "Inside," he said. Just that. No drama, no smile. Lightning cracked somewhere in the distance. My son squealed in delight, like this was the best theme park ride ever. I stumbled toward the porch, clutching wet fabric, but the ground turned slick, and my foot slid. The shirts went flying. Strong hands caught me before I hit the mud. For a second, the rain slowed. The world narrowed to the grip around my arm, steady and firm. His face was close, closer than it had any right to be. Drops of rain traced down his jaw, caught in the stubble at his chin. His eyes were gray, storm-colored, mirroring the sky. "Careful," he said softly. I swallowed, suddenly more aware of my soaked clothes than of the laundry lying abandoned in the dirt. "Thanks," I managed, breathless, in a way that had nothing to do with running. He crouched to retrieve the shirts, shaking them out with a practical flick, and handed them back, as though saving me from face planting in the mud was just part of his job description. My son clapped from the porch, like we had just performed a circus act. "Again, Mom! Do it again," I laughed. Loud, ridiculous, the kind of laugh that slipped out before I could control it. He almost smiled at that, a flicker across his face before he looked away, gathering the last of the laundry. We ran the rest of the way to the porch, dripping, shivering. My mother appeared at the door, horrified. "For heaven's sake, you look like drowned rats." "Correction," I said, teeth chattering. "This drowned rat just saved me from breaking my neck." Her eyes darted to him, then back to me. She didn't say thank you. She didn't even acknowledge him, just turned on her heel and walked inside, muttering something about towels. I stood there, hugging the wet shirts, water pooling at my feet, trying not to look at him. But he lingered a moment, eyes scanning my face, as if deciding whether I was worth another word. "You should be careful," he said finally. "The ground out here, slippery when it rains." "I noticed," I replied, too quickly. He gave a single nod, then disappeared back into the downpour, as though the storm had called him and not me. That night, lying in my childhood bed, I replayed the scene. The way his hand had wrapped around my arm, the steadiness in his voice, the almost smile. I hated myself for thinking about it. Hated that a man who trimmed hedges for a living had just stolen more of my attention in 5 minutes than an entire dinner table of Ivy League pedigrees. Still, when I closed my eyes, I didn't see the chandelier or my mother's pearls. I saw the rain, and him, standing solid in the middle of it like he belonged there. My mother ambushed me at breakfast. I was halfway through a piece of toast, burnt because I hadn't mastered her finicky European toaster, when she dropped the bomb. "You're going out tonight." Crumbs flew from my mouth. "Excuse me?" "Dinner, 8 o'clock, with David Ellison." I groaned. "Mom, David Ellison is practically family. He used to babysit me. He is 38, successful and very interested. He's not your babysitter anymore. He's a lawyer, darling. A real lawyer. Not the type you find online with a 2-star Yelp rating." I wanted to tell her that my divorce attorney's 2 stars had been well earned, but I was too busy choking on indignation. My son snickered from across the table, peanut butter smeared across his cheek. "Does this mean you're going on a date, Mom?" "Ew." I wiped my mouth with a napkin. "No, it means Grandma has lost her mind." But at 8 o'clock, I was sitting across from David Ellison in a restaurant so pretentious it served water with names longer than its entrees. He looked exactly the same as he had in high school, well-groomed, clean-cut, the kind of man who wore cufflinks without irony. "So," he said, adjusting his tie as if preparing for cross-examination, "tell me what you've been up to." I blinked. "You mean since I was 15 and you drove me to soccer practice?" He chuckled politely. "Since the divorce." Ah, there it was. The elephant not just in the room, but stomping across the linen tablecloth. I launched into my rehearsed answer. "I'm freelancing, spending time with my son, trying to keep things balanced. He nodded like a therapist. Resilient. That's good. And your son, he's 7, right? Already thinking about prep schools? Prep schools? I repeated, nearly choking on my sparkling water. He just learned how to tie his shoes without crying. David didn't laugh. He just smiled that tight professional smile that probably won him cases. The waiter brought our entrees, something involving foam, which looked like shaving cream but supposedly cost $40. I stared at it, unimpressed. Do you ever feel like this food is mocking us? I asked. David blinked. Mocking? Yeah, like it's saying, you paid how much for a spoonful of bubbles? He didn't answer. Instead, he launched into a story about a merger he was handling, full of words like equity and due diligence. I nodded along, catching none of it. My mind wandered to the garden back home, damp earth, the smell of roses after rain, and the man who didn't need cufflinks to command my attention. When the dessert menu arrived, I seized the opportunity. Actually, I should probably head back. My son... Of course, David said smoothly. Children come first. I admire that. He leaned across the table as though expecting... something. I froze, unsure if he was going for a kiss or a legal deposition. Thankfully, the waiter appeared, breaking the moment. I all but sprinted out of the restaurant, heels clacking against the marble floor. By the time I reached the car, I was laughing so hard I had tears in my eyes. Not from joy, more from the absurdity of it all. When I got home, the house was quiet. My son was asleep upstairs. My mother had retired with her book club novel. I stepped onto the patio for air. The night sky spread wide above me. And there, faintly lit by a garden lantern, was the gardener. He was kneeling by the roses, hands deep in the soil. Working late again. I should have gone inside. I should have pretended not to see him. Instead, I stood there, still in my black dress, still carrying the ghost of a date that wasn't, watching him in silence. He looked up briefly, eyes catching mine in the dim light. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. His silence was worth more than David Ellison's entire vocabulary. And that was when it hit me. The world my mother wanted me to re-enter felt like suffocation. But the quiet world of dirt, rain, and roses, that felt dangerously like breathing. Saturday morning was supposed to be calm. I had planned cartoons, pancakes, and a blissful hour of pretending my life wasn't in shambles. Instead, I woke to silence, the kind of silence that makes parents panic. I bolted upright, no TV blaring, no toy cars crashing, just silence. I found him, my son, outside in the garden, barefoot, pajama pants rolled up, attempting to climb the stone fountain like it was Everest. In one hand, he held his toy sword. In the other, a cookie he'd apparently stolen from the kitchen. "Get down from there," I shouted, racing across the lawn. He grinned down at me, cookie crumbs raining like confetti. "I'm conquering the castle." "You're conquering my blood pressure," I muttered, reaching for him. Of course. I slipped. Again. My flip-flop skidded on wet stone, and I nearly face-planted into the fountain. Strong hands steadied me, hands I knew by now. The gardener. He had appeared out of nowhere, like some kind of soil-covered guardian angel. He lifted my son down with ease, setting him on the grass. "Feet on the ground," he said firmly, but not unkindly. My son pouted, but I was almost king. "Kings don't climb fountains," the gardener replied. "They build them." My son blinked, considering this wisdom, then nodded solemnly. "Okay, I'll build one." I wanted to laugh, but my heart was still pounding from the near accident. "Thank you," I said, brushing dirt off my knees. He shrugged. As if saving me from daily disasters was in his job description. Kids test limits. That's their job. Apparently his job description includes giving me a heart attack before breakfast, I said. That almost smile flickered again. He crouched to check a crack in the fountain, running his fingers along the stone. His hands were rough, nails stained with earth, but his movements were precise, almost gentle. I watched longer than I should have. There was something hypnotic about the way he touched the world, as though nothing was disposable. Not roses, not fountains, not wayward children. My son tugged on his arm. "Hey, mister, do you have kids?" The question hung in the air. I held my breath, ready to apologize for my son's bluntness. "No," he said after a pause. Then, standing, he brushed dirt from his palms. "Not the kind you raise, anyway. Just these." He gestured to the garden. "They keep me busy enough." My son nodded, satisfied with the answer, and ran off to chase a butterfly. I stayed, unsure whether to fill the silence or leave it be. Finally, I said, "He likes you. Kids like anyone who listens. You think that's all it takes?" He looked at me then, really looked, as if weighing the truth of his own words. "Mostly." I wanted to ask him if he thought adults were any different, but before I could, my mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What is going on out here?" She appeared on the patio in a silk robe, coffee cup in hand, looking like a general surveying a battlefield. Her eyes landed on me, on the gardener, on the muddy footprints across the lawn. "Darling, must you always look like you've rolled out of bed straight into chaos?" "Yes," I said flatly. "It's part of my charm." The gardener said nothing. He just picked up his tools and moved toward the hedge, invisible once more. But I saw him glance back. Just once, before disappearing into the green. That night, while tucking my son into bed, he whispered, "Mom, I think the garden guy's a knight." I laughed softly. "Why?" "Because he saves people." I kissed his forehead, smoothing his hair back. Maybe he just saves clumsy moms who don't know how to wear proper shoes. But when I lay in my own bed later, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if my son was right. Maybe knights don't always wear armor. Sometimes they just carry pruning shears. It was bedtime, the hour when children suddenly transform into philosophers. By day, my son fought eating broccoli like it was an act of war. But once the lights dimmed and the blankets tucked in, his mind turned into a confessional booth, and I became his reluctant priest. That night, after I'd read Where the Wild Things Are for the third time, he lay on his side, staring at me with those big, earnest eyes. "Mom," he said, "are we poor now?" The question was a dagger I hadn't expected. I laughed too loudly, a fake sitcom laugh. "Of course not, honey. Look at this house. It's huge. There's a chandelier in the dining room bigger than our old car." He didn't smile. Kids always know when you're lying, especially your own. "But," he fiddled with the edge of his blanket, "you always look worried about money. And you said I couldn't get those new sneakers. And you made pancakes for dinner 3 times last week, 'cause it was cheap." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "We're not poor. We're adjusting. There's a difference." "What's adjusting?" "It means..." I searched for words that didn't sound like excuses. "It means figuring out how to live in a new way." He considered this, then asked the question I had dreaded most. "Does Dad have more money than you?" Silence. Just the hum of the old air conditioner. "Yes," I said finally, because lies rot faster in the dark. "So, if he has more money, does that mean he loves me more?" That broke me. I gripped his hand too tightly, my throat burning. "Listen to me. Money has nothing to do with love. Nothing. Your dad loves you, and I love you. That's all that matters." He stared at me unconvinced. Then he whispered, "But you're the one who's here." I kissed his forehead, hiding the sting of tears. "Exactly. and I always will be. After he drifted off, I slipped outside, needing air. The garden was quiet, the moonlight silvering the roses. And there he was again, the gardener, leaning against a wheelbarrow, wiping his hands with a rag. He looked up when he heard me, but didn't speak. I blurted it out, surprising even myself. Do kids always know the truth before we do? He tilted his head. Sometimes. They see what adults try to hide. I swallowed. He thinks we're poor, because I can't give him what his dad can. The gardener's gaze was steady, unflinching. He doesn't care about sneakers. He cares about who shows up. The simplicity of it undid me. No legal jargon, no polite dinner chatter, no careful performance. Just truth. Is it really that simple? I asked, voice breaking. He shrugged. Life usually is. We're the ones who complicate it. We stood there for a long moment, the night wrapping around us, the only sound the chirp of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves. My chest felt lighter and heavier at once. Back inside, I checked on my son again. His face was peaceful, mouth open slightly in the innocence of sleep. He had no idea how much his words had cracked something open in me. For years, I had chased the appearance of stability, the house, the clothes, the marriage, the smile plastered on at galas. Now I was learning, from a 7-year-old and a man with dirt under his nails, that stability was simpler. Harder, but simpler. That night I dreamed of a house smaller than this one, messy but full of laughter, and of a garden where roses grew without anyone watching. It began with whispers. That's how my family always worked. They never confronted directly. They let gossip bloom like weeds, invasive and impossible to ignore. I came downstairs one morning to find my mother on the phone, her voice hushed but sharp, like scissors snipping cloth. Yes, the gardener. No, I wasn't aware. Well, thank you for telling me. She hung up when she saw me, her face arranged into that perfect mask of composure she wore at funerals and fundraisers. What was that? I asked, pouring coffee into a chipped mug I'd rescued from the back of the cupboard. Nothing you need to concern yourself with, she said smoothly. Which, of course, meant it was everything I needed to concern myself with. By lunch, the whispers had grown into a full-on performance. My mother's friend, Mrs. Ellison, because of course it was her, leaned close at the table and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Such a shame, isn't it, when people with questionable pasts end up so close to the family?" My fork clattered against the plate. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Ellison raised her eyebrows, feigning innocence. "Oh, darling, I just assumed you knew. About him, the gardener." I forced a laugh. "What, that he trims hedges for a living? Shocking." Her smile was sweet and poisonous. "That he was arrested years ago. Something to do with a fight or maybe theft. I can't recall the details. But one does wonder what kind of man spends his life digging in dirt after that." My stomach flipped. My mother said nothing, just sipped her tea as though this conversation were about the weather. That afternoon, I couldn't stop myself. I found him in the garden, repairing a broken trellis. The sunlight caught the sweat on his neck, the roughness of his hands. He looked up, calm as ever. "Is it true?" I blurted, my voice sharper than I intended. He blinked. "Depends on what you've heard." "That you were arrested." He set down the hammer slowly, deliberately, like a man laying down a weapon. His jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't flinch. "Yes." The world tilted. I wanted him to deny it, to laugh, to tell me Mrs. Ellison was gossiping again. Instead, he wiped his hands on his jeans and waited. "For what?" I asked, my throat dry. "A fight," he said. "Bar fight, years ago. Someone got hurt worse than they should have. I did time for it." Silence stretched between us, heavy as wet soil. My heart pounded in my chest. equal parts fear and something else I couldn't name. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "Because it's not who I am anymore," he said simply. "And because most people don't care to hear the truth. They just want a reason to keep their distance." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. But the image of my mother's disapproving face, the sound of Mrs. Ellison's poisonous smile, pressed down on me. I started, then stopped. "I need to think." He nodded once, picked up the hammer, and returned to the trellis as though the conversation had been about the weather. But I felt the distance like a wall rising between us. That night, lying awake in my childhood bed, I replayed his words. It's not who I am anymore. Wasn't that what I wanted for myself? To not be defined by my past mistakes? To not be judged for my divorce, my failures, my stumbles? Yet part of me still trembled, not because of what he had done, but because of how much I suddenly cared. The next few days passed in a fog, or maybe it was just me, walking around with my head full of static. I avoided the garden, which, in this house, meant I avoided the only place that had begun to feel like mine. My mother noticed, of course. She always noticed. "See?" she said over breakfast, buttering her toast with a surgical precision. "Sometimes people show you who they really are. Best not to ignore the signs." I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that people change, that mistakes don't define a life. But the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. Not about him. Not about myself. My son was the only one oblivious. He kept asking if the garden knight could come inside to play cards or show him how to build a birdhouse. Each time I mumbled an excuse. "He's busy. He has work. Not today." One afternoon, I caught sight of him through the window. He was repairing the fence at the far end of the property, his back to me. There was no wave, no nod, no acknowledgement. Just the rhythm of his hammer against wood, steady and unbothered. It hurt more than I expected. That evening, my mother hosted another dinner. This time I sat through it in silence, stabbing my fork at roast chicken while Mrs. Ellison prattled on about her trip to Milan. At one point, Mr. Bradley leaned over and said, "You know, you should consider yourself lucky moving back here. Some women aren't given second chances." Second chances. The words stuck in my throat like gristle. After dessert, I slipped outside for air. The garden was dark, but I could hear him. Somewhere beyond the hedges, moving tools, the faint scrape of metal against wood. I wanted to call out, to apologize, to bridge the distance. Instead, I stood frozen, the words tangled in my throat. My fear of judgment, of repeating old mistakes, outweighed my courage. I turned back before he could see me. In bed that night, my son whispered, "Mom, did the garden knight do something wrong?" I closed my eyes. "Why do you ask?" "Because you don't talk to him anymore." I pulled him close, burying my face in his hair. He smelled of soap and peanut butter. "It's complicated," I whispered. He wriggled free enough to look at me. "No, it's not. He's nice. Nice people shouldn't be punished forever." I had no answer for that. Children always collapse the walls we build with words. Lying awake long after he slept, I thought about the gardener's voice that night in the moonlight. It's not who I am anymore. Maybe the real question wasn't whether I could trust him. Maybe it was whether I could forgive myself for even needing the answer. The envelope was waiting on the hall table, white and heavy, like a tiny guillotine. My name scrawled across the front in cold, official print. I knew before I opened it, knew the way a body senses a storm before the first drop of rain. Final notice. The words danced in front of my eyes. The balance due glared at me, a number bigger than my monthly income, bigger than my pride could swallow. I stuffed the paper back into the envelope, shoved it under a stack of magazines, and prayed my mother wouldn't see it. As if hiding it could erase the truth. I couldn't afford my life, not even the version of it patched together with duct tape and denial. That night at dinner, I picked at my food while my mother prattled about a charity gala. She slid a check across the table, casual as if she were passing the salt. I've spoken to an old friend at the museum. They're looking for a new development assistant. I've arranged an interview, and in the meantime, this will help with whatever little expenses you've managed to collect. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of ownership. I stared at the check. 5 digits, enough to wipe out the notice, maybe even buy the sneakers my son kept asking for. My hands trembled, but not from gratitude. It was a leash disguised as salvation. "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile. But my stomach turned. Later, I stepped outside for air. The garden was dark, quiet except for the chirp of crickets. I saw him in the distance, stacking tools into the shed, shoulders outlined against the faint lantern glow. I thought about walking over, telling him everything, the notice, the check, the way I felt like a puppet dangling from strings. Instead, I stood frozen, the words locked inside me. He didn't look up, didn't call out, just closed the shed door and disappeared into the night. Back in my room, I opened the envelope again. The check gleamed under the lamplight. My son's soft snores drifted from the next room, a reminder of why I couldn't afford pride. I pressed the paper flat against the desk, my chest tightening. This house wasn't a sanctuary. It was a gilded cage. And tonight, for the first time, I wondered if I had the courage to find the key, or if I would keep cashing the checks and pretending it was freedom. It happened over breakfast, which felt like an insult. Life-changing conversations should at least wait until after coffee, not ambush you while you're buttering toast. My mother folded the newspaper with a snap, her pearls catching the light. "We need to talk." Those 4 words were never good news. She slid another envelope across the table. This one wasn't a check. It was a folder, thick with documents. "A proposal," she said crisply. "David Ellison has agreed to help with your situation. The job at the museum, a stable income, the chance to rebuild your reputation. He'll even help with tuition for your son, but it requires one thing from you." I stared at the folder like it was radioactive. "Which is?" Her eyes didn't waver. "You must stop seeing the gardener." The toast dropped from my hand. "I'm not... Don't insult me, darling. I see the way you look at him, and more importantly, the way people are beginning to talk. A man with a record, with dirt under his nails. It reflects on all of us. You have a child to think about. Do you want his classmates whispering about his mother's choices?" Heat rose in my chest. "So the solution is to sell myself to the Ellisons? Again?" Her face hardened. "It's not selling. It's securing your future. You had your experiment with independence. It failed. This is your second chance." I opened my mouth to argue, but a voice behind me cut in. "I didn't realize I was part of a business transaction." I froze. He was there, standing in the doorway from the garden, holding a bundle of tools. His shirt was streaked with dirt, his eyes unreadable. How long had he been there? Long enough. My mother's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Speak of the devil." He set the tools down with deliberate care. "I don't want to cause trouble. If my being here..." "No," I said too quickly, standing so fast my chair scraped the floor. "You're not the problem." The room went still. My son patted in, rubbing his eyes, sensing the storm. "What's happening?" he mumbled. "Nothing, sweetheart," I said, forcing calm. "Just adults being ridiculous." But the gardener's gaze was on me, steady, waiting. My mother's eyes burned with quiet triumph, and my son's small hand slipped into mine, anchoring me. Something in me snapped. "I'm done," I said, voice shaking but louder than I intended. "I'm done being told what's respectable, what's acceptable, who's good enough. I made one bad choice in marriage, yes, but I won't make another just to please you." My mother's face went pale, then cold. "So you choose him?" I swallowed. The truth lodged in my throat like a stone. Did I choose him, or did I choose myself? "I choose not to be owned," I said finally. The silence that followed was deafening. My son gripped my hand tighter. The gardener didn't move, didn't speak, but his jaw unclenched, just slightly, as though something heavy had shifted. My mother rose, gathering the folder with a sharp motion. "You'll regret this." Maybe I would. Maybe I wouldn't. But for the first time in years, the regret would be mine to own. The house felt different after that morning. Not quieter. My mother still moved through it with the same commanding presence, heels clicking like gavel strikes, but looser somehow, as if my words had cracked something in the walls. She barely spoke to me for 2 days. When she did, it was all clipped civility. "Pass the salt. Pick him up from school at 3. It hurt, but it also felt strangely freeing. Her silence meant I didn't have to explain myself anymore. The envelope with her check still sat on my desk, untouched. I'd stared at it every night, fingers itching, telling myself 100 stories about how it could fix everything. But I never cashed it. Not because I didn't need it, I did, but because taking it would mean erasing the only stand I'd ever taken. One evening, I found myself wandering into the garden again. The sky was bruised purple with dusk, the lanterns not yet lit. He was there, as always, bent over the soil, coaxing something fragile into life. He looked up when I approached, but didn't speak. Just waited. "I owe you an apology," I said, my voice catching. "I let them get in my head. I let their stories about you drown out the truth in front of me." He wiped his hands on a rag, expression unreadable. "You don't owe me anything." "I think I do," I insisted, "because you've been the only person here who hasn't asked me to be something I'm not. And I trailed off, words dissolving into the cool night air. For the first time, he smiled. A real smile, small but steady. "You don't need to explain. Not to me." We stood there in silence, the earth smelling of rain, the roses faint in the dark. My son's laughter floated from the house, high and unburdened. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. He nodded. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" His eyes met mine, gray and unwavering, all the time. But then I remember, plants don't ask if they belong. They just grow where they're planted, or they break through the cracks if they have to. The words lodged deep inside me, simple and devastating. I didn't kiss him. There was no dramatic embrace, no cinematic music swelling. Instead, I stood beside him, our shoulders almost touching, breathing the same air. And for once, that was enough. Later, lying in bed, I thought about the future, about bills, work, maybe moving into a small apartment where I could paint the walls any color I wanted, about building something messy in mine. I didn't know if he would be part of it, not yet. Love isn't always a thunderclap. Sometimes it's just the steady presence of someone who shows up again and again, until you realize they've rooted themselves quietly in your life. What I knew was this. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of being poor, not of being judged, not of failing, because I had finally chosen myself. And for the first time in years, the future didn't look like a sentence. It looked like an open door.